The village of Umudike lay silent under the weight of the approaching night. The sky, painted in hues of orange and purple, stretched endlessly above the thatched huts and winding footpaths. Smoke curled from cooking fires, filling the air with the scent of roasted yam and spicy pepper soup. In a small mud hut at the edge of the village, Ifunanya sat alone, her heart heavy with a fate she could not escape. Tomorrow, she would become the wife of Chief Okafor. The thought sent a shiver through her spine. He was a man old enough to be her father, known not just for his wealth, but for his cruelty. A man who had already buried 2 wives, with whispers that neither had died a natural death. And yet, her family had agreed. She had been promised to him as payment for a debt, her father's final act before vanishing from their lives. Her mother, weak and weary, had pleaded, "There is no other way, my child. If we refuse, we will be cast out." Ifunanya understood. They had no land, no riches, no power. And in their world, a woman's fate was rarely her own to decide. But her heart was not ready to surrender. A love forbidden. A rustling outside the hut startled her. Before she could react, a familiar voice whispered, "Ifunanya." Her breath caught in her throat. "Obinna." She turned, and there he was, his tall figure barely visible in the dim light, his eyes burning with urgency. Obinna, the man she loved. The man she was supposed to marry. He stepped inside, his hands rough from days of work in the fields. "Tell me this is a lie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you are not marrying him." Tears welled in her eyes. "I have no choice." His jaw tightened. "We always have a choice." She shook her head. "My mother will not survive if I refuse. We will lose everything." Obinna reached for her hand. "Then we will leave. Tonight. Just you and me." Her heart leapt at his words. She had dreamed of this, of running far away where no one could dictate their fate. But dreams were not reality. "They will come after us," she whispered. "Let them," he said fiercely. "I will protect you." A tear slid down her cheek. "And if they catch us? If they kill you?" For the first time, he had no answer. She pulled her hand away, her heart breaking. "I cannot let you risk your life for me, Obinna." He swallowed hard, stepping back as if wounded. "So you will marry him?" She wiped her tears, forcing herself to be strong. "I will do what I must." The silence between them was heavy, filled with everything they wanted to say but couldn't. Then, without another word, Obinna turned and disappeared into the night. Ifunanya's chest ached as she watched him go. Tomorrow, she would become Chief Okafor's wife. But deep in her heart, she knew, this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The morning sun rose too soon, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and pink. The village of Umudike was alive with preparations for the wedding. Dancers rehearsed their steps, women pounded yam for the feast, and drummers tested the rhythm that would announce the bride's arrival. Inside her mother's hut, Ifunanya sat motionless as the village women adorned her in coral beads and wrapped her in a deep blue George wrapper embroidered with gold. The scent of freshly ground camwood filled the air as one of the older women painted delicate patterns on her arms and legs. "You will be the most beautiful bride Chief Okafor has ever seen," one of them said. Ifunanya forced a smile, but her heart was far from the celebration. Her mother, frail and tired, placed a gentle hand on her cheek. "You will have a good life, my daughter. You will never lack anything." Ifunanya looked into her mother's tired eyes and swallowed the words she longed to say. But what of love? What of happiness? She knew the answer. In this village, a woman's duty came before her desires. The time had come. The village square was packed with people, their faces filled with excitement. Chief Okafor stood proudly, his large frame draped in a crimson agbada, his many gold rings glinting in the sunlight. He was surrounded by his kinsmen, all beaming with approval. Ifunanya's feet felt heavy as she walked toward him, guided by the women of the village. Every step felt like a final nail in the coffin of her freedom. She kept her gaze low, refusing to meet Chief Okafor's eyes. As the ceremony began, the elders spoke of duty, of tradition, of obedience. They poured libations to the ancestors, asking for their blessings. The drummers played louder, masking the rapid beating of Ifunanya's heart. Then came the moment of finality, the moment she had dreaded most. A cup of palm wine was placed in her hands. She was to walk to Chief Okafor and offer it to him, sealing their union. Her fingers trembled as she held the wooden cup. The weight of her choice pressed down on her shoulders. But just as she took her first step, a loud voice rang through the crowd. "Stop this wedding!" Gasps filled the air. The drummers halted. The elders turned in shock. Ifunanya's heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the crowd, stood Obinna. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes burned with determination. Murmurs spread like wildfire. "What is the meaning of this?" Chief Okafor thundered, his voice thick with anger. Obinna took a bold step forward. "I will not let this wedding continue. Ifunanya does not love you, and she does not belong to you." The crowd erupted in shock. Some gasped in horror, others murmured in approval. Chief Okafor's eyes darkened. "Boy, do you know what you are saying?" Obinna did not flinch. "I know exactly what I am saying. I love Ifunanya, and she loves me. I will not stand by and watch her be given away like a prize." Ifunanya's breath hitched. He had risked everything for her. But at what cost? The elders rose, their faces grave. "This is an insult to our tradition," one of them said. "The bride price has been paid. The wedding must go on." Obinna turned to Ifunanya, his voice softer now. "Tell them, Ifunanya. Tell them the truth." Every eye turned to her. Her hands tightened around the cup of palm wine. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it would deafen her. If she spoke, she would bring shame upon her mother, disgrace upon her family. If she remained silent, she would be trapped in a life she did not choose. The choice was hers. And the whole village was waiting. The village square fell into a suffocating silence. Every eye was on Ifunanya, waiting, watching. The weight of her decision pressed down on her chest like a boulder. She looked at the cup of palm wine in her trembling hands. It was more than just a drink, it was a symbol of her fate. If she walked to Chief Okafor and gave it to him, her life would be sealed. If she defied tradition and refused, she would bring shame upon her mother and risk the wrath of the chief. Her eyes lifted to meet Obinna's. In them, she saw hope, love, and a promise of freedom. Then she turned to her mother. The older woman's face was lined with worry, her thin hands wringing in her lap. Tears burned in Ifunanya's eyes. She was torn between duty and love, between fear and courage, between a life chosen for her and a life she wanted to choose. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Then, slowly, she took a deep breath and made her decision. Defiance. Ifunanya turned toward Chief Okafor. The crowd exhaled in relief. The elders nodded approvingly. It seemed she had chosen the path of obedience. She took a slow step forward. Then another. But just as she reached him, she did something that shocked everyone. She let go of the cup. It slipped from her fingers, crashing to the ground. The palm wine spilled into the earth, soaking into the dust. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The drummers stopped. The women clutched their chests in horror. Ifunanya lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. "I cannot do this." Chief Okafor's face darkened with rage. "What did you say?" Her voice grew stronger. "I cannot marry you." The village erupted in chaos. Some shouted in disbelief. Others whispered amongst themselves, excited by the rare act of defiance. The elders stood, their expressions grave. "This is unacceptable," one of them said. "The bride price has been paid. This marriage must happen." Obinna stepped forward, standing protectively beside her. "No, it must not." Chief Okafor's fists clenched. His face was red with fury. "You insult me in front of the whole village?" Ifunanya swallowed hard but held her ground. "I do not love you. And I will not be forced into a marriage I do not want." The chief's face twisted with anger. "You think love is enough to sustain you? Foolish girl. Without me, your family will starve." Obinna squared his shoulders. "She will not starve. She will have me." The murmurs grew louder. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. The chief turned to Ifunanya's mother. "Do you hear this? Your daughter shames you. You will lose everything because of her disobedience." Tears streamed down the older woman's face. She turned to Ifunanya, her voice breaking. "My child, please. Think of our family." Ifunanya's heart ached. She loved her mother. She didn't want to see her suffer. But for the first time in her life, she knew she had to choose herself. She took a deep breath. "I will find another way to care for you, Mama. But I cannot live a life of misery just to repay a debt that is not mine." The elders whispered among themselves, their faces troubled. This was unheard of. No woman had ever openly rejected a marriage in this way. Finally, the oldest of them stood. His voice was deep and commanding. "The gods have seen this defiance. If they disapprove, they will bring punishment upon her." Everyone turned to the sky, waiting. But nothing happened. The trees did not shake. The wind did not howl. The earth did not tremble. It was as if the gods themselves had accepted Ifunanya's choice. A stunned silence fell over the village. The elder nodded. "Then it is settled." Chief Okafor's face twisted in anger. He let out a bitter laugh. "You think you have one, girl? You will regret this decision." With that, he stormed away, his kinsman following closely behind. Ifunanya's mother sank to the ground, weeping. "What have you done, my child?" Ifunanya knelt beside her, holding her hands. "I have chosen my own path, Mama, and I will not let you suffer because of it. I promise you." Obinna placed a reassuring hand on Ifunanya's shoulder. "We will build a life together. I swear it." The village watched in awe. A woman had defied tradition. And for the first time, tradition had bowed to love. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of red and orange. The village remained in a hushed shock long after Chief Okafor had left. Ifunanya and Obinna stood side by side, the weight of their choice settling in. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Ifunanya felt something she had never felt before: freedom. Her mother wiped her tear-streaked face, her expression a mixture of worry and reluctant acceptance. "Where will we go?" she asked softly. Obinna turned to her. "We will find a way. I have saved some money from my farm work. It is not much, but it is enough to start fresh." Ifunanya looked at her mother. "Mama, will you come with us?" Her mother hesitated, glancing at the villagers still watching. In their eyes, she saw pity, judgment, and perhaps even admiration. She sighed deeply. "I cannot leave the only home I have ever known. But I will not stand in your way." Ifunanya squeezed her mother's hands. "I will come back for you, I promise." Her mother nodded slowly, pulling her into a tight embrace. "May the gods protect you, my child." With one last glance at the village that had been her prison, Ifunanya turned to Obinna. "Let's go." And with that, they stepped into the unknown, hand in hand. The journey was not easy. The road to the neighboring village was long, and night had fallen by the time they arrived. They sought refuge with an old friend of Obinna's, a kind-hearted farmer named Namdi, who welcomed them with open arms. "You are brave to defy the chief," Namdi said as they sat around a small fire. "But you must be careful. A man like Okafor does not forgive easily." Ifunanya shivered, remembering the threat in the chief's eyes. "We have no choice but to move forward." Obinna reached for her hand, his grip firm. "We will build a life here. Together." And so, their new life began. Obinna worked the fields, while Ifunanya helped the women in the market, learning how to trade and sew. Days turned into weeks, and though they had little, they had each other. But peace was short-lived. One evening, as they prepared to eat, a messenger arrived. His face was pale with fear. "You must leave. Now." Obinna's heart pounded. "Why?" The messenger swallowed hard. "Chief Okafor has not forgotten. He has sent men to find you. If they catch you, you will not live to see the morning." Ifunanya felt her blood run cold. Their past had caught up with them. And now, their love would face its greatest test. Obinna sprang to his feet, his mind racing. Ifunanya's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the wooden bench. "How far are the men?" Obinna asked the messenger urgently. "They are close," the man whispered. They left the village at dawn. By nightfall, they will be here. Obinna turned to Ifunanya. We must go. Now. Namdi, their kind host, frowned deeply. Where will you run to? The chief's influence stretches far. Ifunanya swallowed hard. We cannot stay here and wait for them. Namdi hesitated, then nodded. There is a path through the forest. It is dangerous, but it will take you beyond the chief's reach. Obinna squeezed his friend's shoulder. Thank you, Namdi. May the gods reward you. With nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small bundle of food, they disappeared into the darkened forest, their only hope lying beyond the towering trees. Through the shadows. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. The path was barely visible under the dim moonlight, and every snapping twig sent a wave of fear through Ifunanya's chest. Obinna held her hand firmly, guiding her carefully. Stay close, he whispered. They walked for hours, exhaustion weighing down their limbs. Just as they thought they were safe, the distant sound of footsteps made Ifunanya's blood turn cold. They are here, she whispered, gripping Obinna's arm. Obinna's heart pounded. He pulled her behind a thick tree, holding his breath as the voices grew closer. We know they came this way, a rough voice said. They cannot be far, another replied. Ifunanya closed her eyes, silently pleading with the gods. Please, do not let them find us. The men lingered for what felt like an eternity, their torches casting flickering shadows against the trees. Then, slowly, the voices faded as they moved further down the path. Obinna exhaled in relief. We must keep moving. Ifunanya nodded, her legs weak with fear. Where will we go? Obinna's jaw tightened. There is only one place left, the village of my mother's people. They will shelter us. Ifunanya nodded. It was their only hope. Hand in hand, they continued into the darkness, the night stretching endlessly before them. They had escaped for now. But Chief Okafor was not done with them yet. The night stretched long and endless as Ifunanya and Obinna pushed through the dense forest, their bodies exhausted but their spirits unwilling to break. The rustling leaves and distant hoots of owls reminded them that they were not alone, danger lurked in every shadow. Obinna's grip on Ifunanya's hand was firm. We are close, he whispered, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. By dawn, they emerged from the thick forest onto a narrow dirt path. The sight before them brought a flicker of hope, huts neatly arranged in a crescent, smoke rising gently from cooking fires, and children laughing as they chased each other. This is Umuagu, Obinna said. My mother's village. Ifunanya clutched his arm. Will they accept us? They must, he said, leading her toward an elderly woman sitting beneath a tree. As they approached, the woman's face lit up in surprise. Obinna smiled. Maman Ngozi, it is I. The old woman rushed to embrace him. My child. You have returned. She pulled back to look at Ifunanya. And who is this? This is Ifunanya, my wife, Obinna said firmly. Maman Ngozi's expression softened. You are welcome, my dear. Come, you must be hungry. As they followed her, Ifunanya felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally found a place to rest. Days passed, and for the first time in a long while, Ifunanya felt safe. The villagers were kind, welcoming her as Obinna's wife. She helped the women fetch water and prepare meals, while Obinna worked in the fields. But peace never lasted long. One evening, as she sat outside their small hut, peeling cassava, she noticed a man standing at the edge of the village. His gaze was fixed on her, his posture too still. Her heart pounded. Something about him felt wrong. She rose slowly and entered the hut, her breath quickening. Obinna, she whispered. There is a man watching us. Obinna tensed, setting down the yam he was slicing. He moved cautiously to the doorway and peered outside. The man was gone. A cold shiver ran down Ifunanya's spine. I don't like this, she murmured. Obinna wrapped his arms around her. Do not worry, my love. We are safe here. But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his mind. Had Chief Okafor finally found them? Obinna barely slept that night. Every rustling leaf, every distant footstep made his heart race. Ifunanya lay beside him, her breathing soft and steady, but he knew she was just as afraid. By morning, the village bustled with its usual routine, women preparing food, children playing, and men heading to the fields. But the uneasy feeling lingered in Obinna's chest. He decided to speak with Mama Ngozi. "I saw a stranger watching our hut last night," he told her as she pounded yam outside her home. "Has anyone new arrived in the village?" The old woman frowned. "No one that I know of, my son. But I will ask around." Just then, a young boy ran up to them, panting. "Mama Ngozi, elders are calling for a meeting. There is trouble." Obinna's stomach twisted. He exchanged a glance with Ifunanya, who had just stepped out of their hut. "We should go," she said, gripping him. The village square was packed. The elders sat on their wooden stools, their faces grave. The villagers murmured in confusion. Then, from the crowd, a figure stepped forward. Obinna's blood turned cold. It was Mazi Uche, one of Chief Okafor's men. A smug smile stretched across his lips. "I bring a message from my master," he announced. His voice was loud, carrying over the gathered crowd. "Ifunanya belongs to Chief Okafor. He has paid her bride price, and she must return." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Obinna stepped protectively in front of Ifunanya. "She is my wife now. She will not go with you." Mazi Uche chuckled. "You think you can defy the chief and live peacefully? He has been patient, but his patience is running out." An elder stood. "We do not support the forceful taking of a woman," he said firmly. "Ifunanya is here by her choice." Mazi Uche's smile faded. "Then the chief will take action himself." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the village path. The square erupted into worried whispers. Ifunanya's hands shook as she looked up at Obinna. "What will we do?" Obinna clenched his fists. "We prepare. If the chief comes, we will not run anymore." But what he did not know was that the real betrayal was yet to come. The village remained tense after Mazi Uche's visit. Obinna and Ifunanya knew that Chief Okafor would not let the matter rest. Every night, they took turns staying awake, listening for any sign of danger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Obinna sat with Mama Ngozi, discussing their next move. "I fear for the village," Mama Ngozi said. "The chief is powerful. If he cannot take Ifunanya by force, he may punish everyone for protecting you." Obinna sighed heavily. "We cannot keep running. Ifunanya deserves a life free of fear." Mama Ngozi nodded. "Then we must seek the elders' help. They may have a way to negotiate." Just then, a young boy ran into the compound, breathless. "Obinna, Ifunanya needs you, now." Obinna's heart pounded as he sprinted toward their hut. When he arrived, he froze. Ifunanya stood in the center of the room, her face pale. Across from her stood a man he had once called a brother, Namdi. "Namdi," Obinna gasped. The betrayal was written all over Namdi's face. He avoided Obinna's gaze, his fists clenched at his sides. "I had no choice," Namdi muttered. "The chief promised me land, wealth. He said if I led him to you, he would spare the village." Ifunanya's voice shook. "You betrayed us." Before Namdi could answer, heavy footsteps thundered outside. Chief Okafor had arrived. The village square was already filled with people when Obinna and Ifunanya were dragged there by the chief's guards. The villagers watched in silence, their fear evident. Chief Okafor stepped forward, dressed in his finest robes. His eyes gleamed with triumph. "You thought you could escape me, girl," he sneered at Ifunanya. "You were bought and paid for. You belong to me." Ifunanya straightened, her voice unwavering. "I am not your property." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The chief's face darkened. He turned to Obinna. "And you? You think love can defy power?" He signaled to his guards. "Teach him a lesson." Before Obinna could react, two men seized him. A heavy fist struck his face, sending him to the ground. Ifunanya screamed, "Stop!" But the blows kept coming. The villagers looked away, afraid to intervene. Even Namdi stood frozen, guilt and shame on his face. Then, a sudden voice rang out. "Enough!" It was the eldest village chief, his frail body standing firm. "This is not our way. A woman is not a prize to be bought. She has spoken her choice." The villagers slowly began to murmur in agreement. Even the guards hesitated. Chief Okafor's face twisted with rage. "She belongs to me." "No," another elder said. "She belongs to herself." A shift moved through the crowd. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, standing between the chief and Ifunanya. The chief's power was crumbling. Realizing he was outnumbered, Chief Okafor spat on the ground. "This village will regret this." Then he turned and stormed away with his men. Obinna struggled to stand, blood on his lips, but Ifunanya was already at his side, holding him. "It's over," she whispered. He pulled her close. "We are free." Namdi stepped forward, shame in his eyes. "Obinna." Obinna shook his head. "I trusted you." Namdi swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "Forgive me." Ifunanya looked at Obinna. A choice had to be made: hold on to betrayal or choose forgiveness. After a long silence, Obinna sighed. "It will take time, but I will try." A look of relief crossed Namdi's face, and for the first time in days, Ifunanya smiled. She was free. She had chosen love. And love had won. The end.